So now we understand the basis of how we should expect truthy or falsy values to evaluate in JavaScript. We can now start to actually use some real conditional logic in this course. So let's go ahead and talk about the first thing which will be an integral part of all programming logic is the if and the else if statement. Now, even though the terminology such as else if varies across different languages, the principles are the same. So if you're coming from an existing language, we can easily transfer any knowledge you do have into JavaScript syntax. So let's assume that we have some kind of constant or a variable in our JavaScript application, and we can call this our condition. Now, all I'm going to do is simply say that this condition is going to be true. Now, this could be done in various ways. It could be if the number 1 is greater than the number 5, and these could be dynamic values, or it could be the number 1 is less than the number 5, or less than or equal to, in which case something like this would evaluate to true. But for now, we'll keep things nice and simple and just work with a pure true or a false value, and we'll switch this over to false momentarily. Now, for learning a conditional statement, a conditional block allows us to declare where we would like to create a new block and execute a piece of code if a particular condition is satisfied. So in our case, we have this const condition, which is definitely true. So we're going to say if the condition, and inside of that, we can go ahead and just say console log, and all I'm going to say is the word yes inside it. Now let's save this out, and we can see that the yes has been printed out in our debugging console. So the if statement is a case where we want to run a piece of logic depending on how the expression is evaluated. Now, typically these things would live inside of a function or a group of functions rather than floating out in what looks like very procedural code. Now, it's up to us how we want to run these conditions, and it's good to know that you can actually create nested if statements, or we can have multiple if statements. There is no maximum use of if statements or how far we want to go ahead and nest them down. Now, we've learned the yes approval case where something is in fact true, but let's swap our condition over to false and just see what happens. Now, you may have correctly assumed that nothing would then be printed out in our DevTools console. So what happens if we wanted to actually know that something wasn't satisfied? This is where our else statement comes into play. So we can say if this condition, otherwise it's definitely not happened. So here I'm just going to say no. And what we can do is just evaluate this again, and we can swap that over. So this is what we would call a typical if and an else block. You can use an if on its own, or you can add this else to it. Now in JavaScript, you can see that we have these block statements here. So we learned that any let variables, so if we were to change this over to a let and then specify inside of here, it wouldn't in fact be available. So we'll just demonstrate this. We'll say let a equals the number 1, and outside of this block scope, we can console log a. Now you can see that ESLint has automatically jumped in, and it's recognized that a is declared, but its value is never used. So we're not actually using this value of a. Now, it may be that we look like we're using it, but we're in fact in a new block. And as we've learned in the variables chapter, the let keyword has a slightly different behavior over var. Now, if we change this over to var, everything will work as intended. So that's a quick example, and it's good to just recap that before we continue and how the let keyword behaves inside of a new conditional block. So what we'll do is revert this over to our const and continue with these exercises. Now, when it comes to more complicated conditional logic, we might want a more powerful if-else expression. So here we're going to create a constant. We're just going to keep it simple and say that this is our number constant. Now, for this, I'm going to use a let keyword because we want to rebind this result. And all we're going to do is initialize this. And as we've learned, this will have a default value of undefined. Now, you can ignore these red squigglies. This is just because we have not used these variables just yet. So our result is undefined. Our number is 99. And we're going to go ahead and create some if with else if and also else expressions. So let's go ahead and say if the number is the number 1. And you can see here that I'm using the triple equals, and it's a good idea to always use the triple equals, because the double equals could potentially introduce some unknown bugs, which will be very difficult for us to locate at a point in time. So personally, I like to use the triple equals. If I need to use the double equals, and I can't say that it's very often, then we'll go ahead and use that. So we'll stick to triple, and inside of this block, we're going to say the result equals, and all we're going to do for the purposes of this is just change the numeric value to a string value, which could represent the number. And these are typical things that as programmers we would do. So if our number is 1, the result is number 1. And what I'm going to do underneath here is just log out that result. So here we can see that we have an undefined because our number constant is not 1. If we were to quickly change this over, we then get the number 1 as a word. So let's continue and add our else statement. In our else statement, we're simply going to say that there was no match. Now, what we want to do is essentially create a chain so that we can check all these different types of numbers and then return the string representation. So what we can do for this is introduce the else if. And all we need to say is else and then a space. Some other languages like to join these or potentially do something like this, but in JavaScript, they are truly 2 words. Now, it's interesting with an else if because like an if statement, we provide it some expression to be evaluated. So we're checking if number does in fact strictly equal the number type of 1, and we're returning and binding that result to a string value. Now, with an else statement, we do not pass it an evaluation. You can simply think of it as the fallback. Now, with an else if, we can pass in some additional logic. So here I'm going to say if the number equals 99, then our result is going to equal the string value of 99. So you can see here that our else if has just been successfully evaluated, and in the console, we have the string representation of 99. So everything's going good so far. And now it's worth mentioning that we might want to have a nice use case where we want to check for another number. So let's go ahead and add another else if. All we're going to say inside of here is if our number equals 1000, then the result is going to equal 1000. We can, of course, go back to our constant. We'll change the number over to 1. Over in here, we see this reflected. We can add some zeros, and we get 1000 back as the result. Now, if we were to do 10,001, we get no match in our conditional logic expression. So conditionals are a great way that we can dive off and do different pieces of logic. We can perform different operations based on what we are trying to do. And what we're trying to do is evaluate an expression. And this will typically come from perhaps a function argument, which we'll learn about further, or a variable that exists in our JavaScript program. Now, there's not really much more to if and else statements. We've learned that we can, in fact, declare them. We can use these new blocks. It's also worth mentioning that these blocks are purely optional, and we can actually demonstrate this up here. We could go ahead and remove this. We could put this on the same line, and we can essentially remove the curly braces associated with it. And you'll see here that nothing has broken. But if you're like me, you're sat here thinking, it looks a little bit confusing. So what I like to recommend is that we don't do this approach. If you're comfortable with JavaScript, fully comfortable, go ahead. And if it's your preference that you want to do this, then absolutely feel free. We also get the benefit when we do add these braces of the let keyword, as we just mentioned, which also works inside of these curly braces. So there we are. We are at the end of the video. It's a good introduction to conditional thinking. And in the previous lesson, we actually looked at how all of these different values evaluate to a truthy or a falsy value. And this is the place where the evaluation happens. So in this video, we have covered using a condition. We can use multiple conditions. We can mix them with different operators. We could have the number 0 is less than the number 5. We don't necessarily have to pass in a variable to be evaluated. We could, in fact, do our expressions inside of here. But it's good practice to break things down into variables and then pass them in. It keeps things nice and clean. And the patterns that I'm using here are patterns that I apply to everyday real-world programming. We then looked at using the const and the let keyword. We know that this is going to be undefined. And then we're rebinding and re-evaluating. So the good thing about this and using this else is that our result will never actually be undefined by the time it comes to using it. So this is a really good way of declaring a variable with essentially our intent to then rebind it down here. Now, if we go ahead and change this over to a constant, we'll see everything blows up because a constant, remember, cannot be redefined. So there we are with our introduction to conditionals using if, else if, and finally the else statement for when nothing else matches.